Over the past few years, something really interesting has been happening in the gaming industry. PC gamers who for a long time were completely locked out of PlayStation's biggest titles suddenly started getting access to some of Sony's most celebrated games. For decades, the identity of PlayStation was built on exclusivity. If you wanted to experience certain flagship titles, you needed to own a PlayStation console. But that dynamic started to change during the PlayStation 4 era and especially during the PlayStation 5 generation. Sony began bringing its first party titles to PC, and for a while, it felt like a major shift in the company's philosophy. PC players got to experience critically acclaimed games like God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Marvel Spider Man. Usually those releases arrived about a year or two after the PlayStation versions, but for many players that delay was more than acceptable. It felt like Sony had found a compromise that allowed them to keep their exclusives as system sellers at launch while still eventually expanding their audience and generating additional revenue by releasing those same titles on PC later. For a while, that strategy seemed to work extremely well. Sony launched a label called PlayStation PC and continued porting some of its biggest titles to PC platforms like Steam. It was a move that opened the door for millions of new players to experience games that previously would have required buying a PlayStation console. PC gamers benefited from improved graphics options, higher frame rates, and the flexibility of PC hardware, while Sony benefited from selling games to an entirely new audience. On paper, it looked like a win-win situation, but according to a new report, Sony may now be reconsidering that entire strategy. A report from gaming journalist Jason Schreier at Bloomberg suggests that Sony may be planning a significant change in how it handles PC releases going forward. According to the report, Sony no longer intends to bring many of its major single-player PlayStation 5 titles to PC, which would represent a major shift compared to the company's recent approach. Instead of continuing the pattern where PlayStation exclusives eventually make their way to PC after a delay, Sony may be returning to a much more traditional model where the biggest games stay exclusive to the console ecosystem. If that strategy holds, it would effectively end what many PC gamers had begun to see as a new normal, the idea that PlayStation exclusives would eventually arrive on PC sooner or later. What makes this particularly notable is that this shift could affect games that have not even released yet. According to people familiar with Sony's internal plans, certain upcoming PlayStation titles are now expected to remain exclusive to the PlayStation 5 rather than being ported to PC later. Two games specifically mentioned in the report are Ghost of Yotei and Saros. Both are reportedly planned as PS5 exclusives, and current plans to bring them to PC have allegedly been scrapped. The sources cited in the report asked not to be identified because they were not authorized to discuss Sony's internal strategy publicly, but they indicated that at least for now, the company is moving away from the PC port approach for its biggest single-player experiences. That would represent a dramatic reversal from the strategy Sony had been building over the past several years. During the early PlayStation 5 era, Sony seemed increasingly open to the idea that its exclusives could eventually expand beyond the console. Several titles were ported successfully, and Sony executives even talked publicly about PC releases as an important part of the company's growth strategy. The thinking seemed straightforward. Once a game had already sold the bulk of its copies on PlayStation, releasing it on PC later allowed Sony to tap into another market without undermining the initial console sales. In theory, the delay preserved the incentive to buy a PlayStation while still creating a second wave of revenue from PC players. For a while, it seemed like Sony had found a sustainable middle ground between exclusivity and accessibility. However, the report suggests that things inside Sony may not be as straightforward as they appeared from the outside. One of the reasons reportedly being discussed internally is the performance of PlayStation titles on PC. While some ports performed well, others apparently did not meet Sony's expectations in terms of sales. Porting a major AAA game to PC requires additional development work, testing, optimization, and support. If those releases are not generating the level of revenue Sony hoped for, it may make less financial sense to continue investing heavily in that strategy. In other words, if the numbers don't justify the effort, Sony might decide that the benefits simply are not worth it. Another factor mentioned in the report involves concerns about the PlayStation brand itself. Within Sony, there's reportedly a faction that believes releasing PlayStation exclusives on PC could weaken the brand's core identity. For decades, one of the biggest reasons people bought PlayStation consoles was the promise of exclusive experiences that could not be found anywhere else. Those exclusives helped define each generation of the platform. Games like The Last of Us Part 2, God of War Ragnarok, and Ghost of Tsushima became synonymous with PlayStation because they represented experiences you could only get by owning the hardware. If players start believing that every exclusive will eventually arrive on PC anyway, some may decide to skip buying the console entirely. From that perspective, limiting PC ports could help protect the value of the PlayStation ecosystem and ensure that exclusives remain a key driver of console sales. Interestingly, the shift described in the report does not apply to every type of PlayStation game. Sony is reportedly still planning to release certain titles across multiple platforms, particularly online and live service games. Examples mentioned include Marathon and Marvel Dokkan Fighting Souls. That approach makes sense because multiplayer games benefit from having the largest possible player base. Cross platform releases can help keep those games alive longer, maintain healthy matchmaking pools, and increase the overall community around the game. In that case, releasing on PC is not just about sales, it is about ensuring the long term success of the game itself. There is also another category of games that may continue coming to PC even if Sony reduces its own first party ports. Some titles that are published by PlayStation but developed by external studios may still appear on PC as planned. Two examples mentioned in the report are Death Stranding 2, On the Beach, and Kenna Scars of Cosmora. These games are still expected to launch on PC later this year. That suggests Sony's strategy is not a complete shutdown of PC releases. Instead, it appears to be a more selective approach where certain types of games, particularly narrative driven single player titles from Sony's own studios, remain exclusive to the PlayStation ecosystem, while other games continue to expand to additional platforms. Of course, it is important to keep in mind that this report is based on sources familiar with Sony's internal plans, and Sony itself has not officially confirmed the strategy. As of now, the company has declined to comment on the report. Strategies inside large companies can also evolve quickly depending on market conditions, sales performance, and broader industry trends. Even the sources cited in the report indicated that plans could change in the future. However, given the track record of the journalists reporting this story, it is difficult for many people in the industry to dismiss the possibility that Sony really is rethinking its approach to PC releases. Looking at the bigger picture, this situation highlights the balancing act that companies like Sony constantly face. On one hand, expanding to PC opens up access to millions of additional players who may never buy a console. That can generate additional revenue and introduce PlayStation's franchises to a wider audience. On the other hand, exclusivity has always been one of the most powerful tools console manufacturers have for attracting customers. If exclusives become too widely available on other platforms, the incentive to buy the console itself becomes weaker. Sony is essentially trying to navigate the tension between these two realities, and depending on how the numbers look internally, the company may decide that leaning back towards exclusivity is the safer long-term strategy. For PC gamers, this potential shift could be disappointing because it suggests that some of the biggest PlayStation titles may no longer make their way to PC at all. For PlayStation fans, however, the move could reinforce the idea that the console remains the only place to experience certain flagship games. And for the industry as a whole, it serves as a reminder that platform strategies are constantly evolving as companies respond to changing market conditions and consumer behavior. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Sony should continue bringing its big single-player PlayStation games to PC eventually? Or do you think those titles should remain true exclusives that only exist on PlayStation hardware? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon, where the latest exclusive is how the Xbox One lost the momentum that the Xbox 360 had built. Thanks for watching, and as always, game on.